2.5 Admins, episode 192. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, just a quick plug for an article you wrote for InfoWorld, Alan, how to upstream code to open source projects.
Yeah, this is based on a talk I gave at the FreeBSD Vendor Summit and figured it was worth sharing it with a much wider audience, so got that published there.
We might have to talk to you on one of our other shows about that, Alan. We'll see.
Yeah.
Let's do some news then. Ubuntu 24.04 supports easy installation of OpenZFS root file system with encryption. Of course, Ubuntu 24.04 should be out by the time you hear this.
We heard some rumors before when Ubuntu had removed ZFS support from their new installer, or just never added it to the new installer, and people were worried it was maybe the end of the experimental support for ZFS. But no, in the new installer, it's back and with even more options. So when you go to create your new installation, you have the option to erase the disk and use ZFS, or to erase the disk and use ZFS with encryption.
The only unfortunate thing is that the new installer is still using the existing ZSys boot system that Canonical authored, which is a little bit limited. You need a special boot pool as well as a root pool, and the boot pool can't have a lot of features enabled. It's kind of a pain to manage. The good news about it is it's very easy to install, which is the biggest argument I have for using that. If you're not afraid of a somewhat more painful initial installation, as long as you wind up with a better product at the end, I would still recommend not going with Ubuntu's built-in ZFS on root installer and instead doing a ZFS boot menu install of Ubuntu. It is clunkier to get it going. You're going to have to hit the shell and you're going to have to do a manual install using debootstrap, but the instructions are easy enough to follow and they're pretty thorough over at ZFS boot menu itself. And pretty shortly, we're going to have an article going over some of the potential pain points that you might encounter at Clara Systems.
Yeah. So the reason for the separate boot pool is that Grub's support for ZFS is quite limited and doesn't support all of the features. So you have to make a pool with most of those features disabled and use that for boot. And then you can still have all your data on the full feature pool. Do you know how ZFS boot menu loads ZFS, since it obviously doesn't use Grub?
It's a direct EFI boot. There is just a single one file binary that you drop into the right place. On a Linux system, typically mounted under boot EFI boot, oddly enough. But there's just one file underneath there, bootx64.efi, and your motherboard just runs that binary, and that's it.
Yeah, that's the same way the FreeBSD EFI bootloader works. And it just has its own implementation of ZFS built into it.
There are some limitations with ZFS boot menu as well, but they're a lot better handled than the limitations on Canonical's side, in my opinion. There is still the potential that a newer version of ZFS might include on-disk features that the booter in ZFS boot menu won't understand. But that's why one of the steps that you're supposed to follow in the process to set up a ZFS boot menu system is when you create your pool, you create it using the option compat equals 2.1, and that way you won't automatically get any potentially incompatible feature flags enabled at a later date. Even if you build a newer ZFS, it won't be a problem for getting your system up and running.
Yeah, that's why that feature was added to OpenZFS, because even if it's beyond your own bootloader, if you say, I want to create a pool on this machine and I want to be able to import it on that machine, which is an older version. So you can say, yeah, compatibility equals FreeBSD 13 or OpenZFS 2.1. Or at one point, I think we had just a year-based one, but I think now it's mostly ZFS versions and specific releases. But it really does make life a lot easier than having to create a pool and turn certain feature flags off, or create it as like V28 and then upgrade it and only enable the features that are lowest common denominator and so on. So having that little alias system really helps.
And from a user's and or administrator's perspective, I can tell you from experience, it is a lot easier to live with a single pool with all the features available at compat level 2.1 than to have like a teeny tiny boot pool separate from your root pool and having to manage the two separately. That really sucks a lot.
Yeah, and it's like literally the reason why I spent so much time on the FreeBSD bootloader having support for encrypted disks was specifically to avoid needing an unencrypted boot pool and then your separate encrypted data pool, because it really breaks the way you want to do boot environments and just makes upgrades more complicated. And it's definitely a lot of work went into having that. Everything's just one pool. And so I agree with Jim.
So Alan, you are deeply involved with the ZFS community.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you find out about this when Jim posted a Phoronix article in our Telegram group?
About the Ubuntu installer?
Yeah. That suggests to me that they're not really working with the ZFS folks, the OpenZFS folks with this. They're just kind of doing their own thing.
Right. They came to a meeting once, like 4 years ago, when they were first trying to do this, and we saved them from making a big faux pas with the way they were trying to set up encryption, where they wanted to set it with the default password and then have the user change their password, not knowing that that meant that it wouldn't work the way they thought it would. But yeah, nobody from Ubuntu seems to really show up to like our monthly leadership meetings, or not that I'm aware of anywhere on the Slack or the mailing list. And we'd very much love to have them there and be willing to help them out and make sure things are kept well, and even just give them advice on what features maybe should be backported to the version of ZFS that they ship in the long-term support versions. Like in 2204, they ship ZFS 215, and there's a really, really useful fix in 216. That's a couple of lines that really could have been backported to their version of 215. And on a heavily fragmented pool can mean importing it takes a couple seconds instead of 30 minutes.
This smells kind of fishy because this is the first time I've ever heard anybody complaining that Canonical did not work sufficiently with upstream vendors to produce a tightly integrated product with all the expertise in all the right places.
Right. I was just saying, the ZFS community is more than willing to help out. Obviously, if they want to pay me to help them, that's great. But the community is willing to help without that. And all they have to do is join our Slack or whatever, and we can make it happen.
Yeah, you do have those community resources. Like, I've seen the videos of the meetings that you have, and anyone's free to show up to that, right?
Yes. And the same with the Slack. And yeah, the meeting has an agenda, so you can see ahead of time, and you can put things on it to make sure that you get time to talk and everything.
So it's very odd that they're just doing all this ZFS stuff on Canonical Island to me.
It's not odd at all. I mean, I was obviously being a little sarcastic earlier, and to be clear, it's mostly affectionate sarcasm, but this is very on brand for Canonical. They just kind of get the bit between their teeth and they do their own thing. They decide that they don't like the choices that the GNOME team is making, so, they spin up Unity. And then they discover that was more pain in the butt than it was worth, and they discontinue it and go back to GNOME. There are quite a few examples like that of upstream communities being irritated with Canonical because they feel, rightly or wrongly, like Canonical just, NIH syndromed their way into an unpleasant place that a lot of folks have to deal with. You mentioned earlier the difference between paid consultation and just show up and ask for community help, and I don't think money is the sticking point there. I think it really is an issue of who feels like they have control and are making the decisions, and I think Canonical wants to feel like they're driving the ship a little bit further, to the point of not necessarily wanting to involve the established experts on some particular piece of software, because they don't necessarily want to do things the way those experts did it. They want to do it their way. And sometimes that can be good. It's not always bad, but it has its set of pros and cons.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. It's I want to make sure they know that we're willing to give them some advice if they just have some questions. They don't have to try to figure it out on their own. But to the counterpoint, it's it seems like a bit of a shame when Amazon is more involved in the community than Canonical.
Oof, that's a brutal comparison.
After years of testing, Seagate claims its heat-assisted HAMR drives are as reliable as traditional PMR storage.
I think the biggest part of this is people don't seem to realize how long Seagate's been working on HAMR. It's getting close to 20 years now, and the version we're seeing now is called Mosaic 3 Plus for a reason. This is the improvement of the third version of this. The earlier ones that weren't as good didn't ever see the light of day. They got a lot of testing at pre-production customers, like cloud vendors who were willing to take the risk in order to get cheap hard drives and so on. But these ones now do appear to be up there, and the heads are guaranteed to last as long, if not longer, than the PMR versions.
I need to correct you both, because HAMR is PMR. PMR is just perpendicular magnetic recording, and HAMR is perpendicular magnetic recording. It is not shingled. The heat assist is completely separate, and there's technically no reason that you couldn't have a heat-assisted shingled magnetic recording drive also.
In fact, they do.
But the majority of the HAMR drives are perpendicular magnetic recording, and I have not personally had hands on one, despite many attempts to convince Seagate to let me. But they have assured me many, many times that the heat assist does not have a negative effect on performance the way that moving from perpendicular to shingle does.
Right. The big advantage is you probably actually get more performance out of the hammer drives because they can pack the bits closer together, so you get a higher density when you're reading. The testing they're talking about in this article is more about, because the head is much more involved because it's got a laser and tries to heat up a part of the platter, is the head going to wear out sooner, or is the material the disk is made of going to suffer from getting heated up and cooled off all the time? And in their testing so far, with a bunch of accelerated testing and the fact that they've been using these in the field for a long time, they found that the heads last at least as long and that the material can withstand it at the rate of things. So you're going to get your 5+ years out of your hard drive without a lot of worries.
And they also talk about Hammer opening up the path towards 50 terabyte drives in the 3.5-inch form factor.
Plus, finally, this makes Rust sexy again. You can't get a solid-state drive with a laser in it, can you?
But at the moment, also, Seagate's the only brand that has this working. Western Digital's experimenting with their
MAMR,
the microwave-assisted magnetic recording, trying to use microwaves instead of a laser to heat things up. But that's not shipping production scale stuff yet. But I'm excited to see these. I do wonder what happens if they end up combining this. I know that they're going to combine it with shingled already, but are they going to combine it with their dual actuator technology? Are we going to get one with 2 lasers? And in particular, the fact that is interesting because, especially as the density keeps going up, you're talking about 26 terabytes, I think now, and that within 2 years or so, we're expecting to get to 50 terabytes. If you're still only getting 250 IOPS, that's going to start to be a bit of an issue. Having a second actuator only gets you to 500 IOPS, but that's still a lot more IOPS per gigabyte or terabyte than what we have now. The real question is there an effective way to be able to use those extra IOPS? Because if you interleave the sectors between the two heads, then you have the problem of you don't actually get any more IOPS because the heads are going to end up moving in sync with each other. And if you don't, how do you make sure that when you go to read something, there's a good chance that the two things you're trying to read at the same time are on different actuators, not on the same?
Well, the obvious way is by treating the single physical drive as 2 logical drives, and you just manage it with, whatever RAID manager you're using already and let it distribute writes the same way it already does.
Yeah, and that's how Seagate demoed this being used with ZFS, was dual ported drives. The problem with that right now is the way they did that required a SAS connection and a controller that understood dual ported drives. I suppose you could make a desktop version that just has 2 SATA ports or something.
Or you could just treat it the way you treat partitions.
Yeah. I wonder if that actually gets closer to I know Seagate had talked all about doing NVMe connected hard drives just for the other advantages of the protocol, and partly because, people are building chassis and fabrics and so on that use that protocol and want to be future-proof and just have everything be the same. If you did it that way, you could use the namespacing feature that NVMe provides that most drives don't use, but you could use to basically default to having those 2 namespaces, the 2 different actuators.
But it's not all good news from Seagate when it comes to hard drives, because they are increasing their prices and they're blaming AI for this because of all the data that needs to be stored for AI bullshit.
Well, in particular, they're saying there's enough demand that they raise the price because they can in order to make sure that there's hard drives available to everybody, I guess. It's interesting because literally in my newsfeed, beside this headline was the headline that the slightly older X18 drives had now hit the lowest price ever on Amazon. So this obviously only affects the newest generation of drives, and there's generally still a lot of the previous gen stuff in the channel. And so it probably at the moment isn't actually going to hit your in the pocketbook if you're trying to build a NAS. It's more that if you're trying to buy quantity of the newest, biggest drives, that there is a lot of competition right now. And if you don't want to wait months, you might have to pay more money.
There's a pretty huge market segmentation too. When you talk about people that are looking to build a NAS, it is wild to me how many questions I field from folks who are looking to build a NAS, don't have any of the parts on hand yet at all, and are talking about, wanting to build it with 8 terabyte drives. And, I'm like, that's not the sweet spot. You shouldn't be buying 8 terabyte drives, to put together a RAID array. You should be looking at bare minimum 12 and, very likely, more like 18.
I'm to the point now that generally I go to serverpartdeals.com and find whatever has the lowest price per terabyte and buy however many I need of that.
And where are we at the moment then? Around 16 to 18?
Yeah, 12, 16, and 18. It depends on the day what they have more in stock. There'll be which one's available for the better price.
Right.
But getting to the region of paying like $10 a terabyte, whereas, if you're shopping retail, you're probably paying closer to $14 a terabyte. You get less warranty, but
yeah,
I tend to do self-warranty because I'm purposely beating these drives up. And when I need new ones, I don't want a replacement of the same size anyway.
Same here. I'm self-warranty on everything. That's a lot of the way that I continue getting repeat business is somebody knows if they buy a system from me, then I cover it. I don't faff around and, everything gets handled immediately, which means that I'm really not doing a warranty replacement even when something is under warranty typically. I'm buying a new whatever the thing was and putting it in instantly. And then in the background, I'm doing the warranty replacement and, maybe I'll use the warranted replacement in another system eventually. But like Alan was saying, it makes it a lot easier to look at things like that in terms of, how you're going to replace it when you're on the hook either way. So it just either it has a decent failure rate or it doesn't. And it kind of almost stops mattering too much what the manufacturer is saying when the warranty replacement already doesn't really work for what you need it to. And I find that a lot of people, that's really where they're at. I mean, that's why they keep buying things from me in a lot of cases as well, because that's great if Dell says that, they'll give you another laptop the next day when that happens, but it's going to be a completely unimaged, just random. It's got Windows on it and nothing else. All your crap's going to be missing. And it turns out that's not what people actually expect when they say, I want my laptop fixed the next day. They want their laptop with their stuff working or server or whatever it is. I've talked about, buying refurbished drives a few times before, and you always get a lot of, oh my God, really? I would never do that, pushback in comments. And I will chime in with Alan. I have bought a lot of refurbished drives, and I have yet to have a single problem with one. I've bought at least 100 of them now, and I have not had one issue.
Yeah, I will say I generally buy the recertified drives, which is slightly different because it's somebody else hasn't owned it in the meantime. But in general, if it's refurbished by the manufacturer, not by a recycler, then it's probably fine. Oftentimes, those drives have a longer lifespan because they've been double checked. They've been through extra QA compared to a brand new drive, which, you have the bathtub curb. But with recertified and refurbished drives, that part's already been taken care of. So you're probably actually going to get something pretty good. And especially if you're self-orienting and so on, you don't want to pay a lot of extra money for the fact that, when this dies, if you go to a website and fill out a bunch of forms and wait and get the sticker and then go and mail it to some place after you find a box that's suitable to ship it in and so on, then in a couple of weeks, we'll send you a replacement, except for, we're Western Digital and we don't make the RE4 model anymore. So here's a drive that's not even the same protocol. I think it was SATA instead of SAS or something. But it's RAID edition, so it's good enough, right? It's like, well, that's not going to work in the server, but gee, thanks for the 4 terabyte hard drive.
I had a Western Digital RMA rep one time demand that I pull. He wanted me to install some Windows diagnostic utility and test the drive with it, despite the fact that A, the drive had been used in a Linux server, and B, the issue was it is completely dead, doesn't show up on the bus whatsoever. I'm just like, why are you wasting my freaking time, man?
Yep, I had Samsung give me the runaround on some SSDs, a similar thing.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what William has done. He writes, as a developer with little interest in being more of a sysadmin than I have to be, I've got a small home NAS, 4TB on RAID 1 setup. Is learning ZFS worth the hassle, or would I be better off using something like XFS or ButterFS that seemingly doesn't require as much tuning?
So obviously the answer is ZFS. I don't think anybody expected me or Alan to say anything different. So the more interesting thing is to talk about why ZFS. The first thing is I want to push back on the whole, is learning ZFS worth the hassle? Learning ZFS is the easiest way you can set up a NAS of this scale, just a couple of drives. It's going to be easier to learn ZFS than it is to learn, MD RAID, which you would otherwise be putting it together with. It's certainly going to be easier to learn than Butter, and it will require less tuning than Butter would. You can use either ZFS or Butter with no tuning whatsoever, and for most use cases, it'll probably be fine either way. When you need the tuning is when you start to have real big kid performance concerns. And once you start having those, I promise you life's going to be a lot uglier under Butter than it is under ZFS. The last thing is I don't think XFS is worth consideration at all here. XFS is a perfectly cromulent legacy file system. I don't really have anything super bad to say about it. It's just not gaining you anything there. So unless you're using a distribution that defaults to XFS, in which case that is the least friction moving forward, don't override your distro's choice, which is almost certainly going to be ext4. XFS isn't going to start giving you any potential benefits until you're looking at 150 terabyte plus arrays. If you're just putting, 2 4 terabyte drives together, ext4 is fine if you don't want advanced features. And if you do want advanced features, ZFS is the easiest way to get them, as well as, in my opinion, and obviously Alan's, the best technically.
Can I just say, as a half admin, I set up a NAS with 2 6 terabyte drives, and they weren't even good drives. They were Barracudas, which are SMR, just the worst possible drives. And I set aside an afternoon to do this, right? And I put them in, I followed the instructions to create the pool. I called it new pool because I'm dumb. And I set up Samba and I was copying stuff onto it within about 10 minutes. And then I had the rest of the afternoon free to do whatever I wanted. And I didn't do anything else. I didn't do any snapshots. I didn't do any replication for months and months and months. I just used it as if it was just a traditional RAID setup. But then later on, I learned about snapshots and replication. And that's when I took advantage of the powerful stuff that ZFS can do. But just to get it set up is super easy. I'm telling you, it's not something you have to worry about.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot of tuning either, or any, really. The ZFS has spent a lot of time making sure the defaults work for everybody. You can always make it better, but the defaults will not be bad for your use case.
Yeah, for your particular use case, right? If you've got a very specific use case, you can tune it to make it better. But yeah, it was never a problem for me. It always just worked fine.
Yeah, if you're not already somebody who's tuning your file system to get significant improvements in your workload that you need and that you actually measure to make certain that you really are improving things when you do it, if you're not that person now, you don't need to be with ZFS either. The last thing I'll mention, I get a fair amount of pushback from folks around the web because of this sort of position I've wound up in as the default, both advocate of ZFS and, Butter hater. I'm not going to pretend I have any different reputation. A lot of people just assume that, well, I learned ZFS and that's the thing I know, and I learned Butter later and I didn't like it because it wasn't ZFS. I would like to put in perspective when I talk about how easy or how difficult something is. My very first software RAID array was a DOS application, MS-DOS. My next one was Windows RAID. I've also used at least 3 or 4 different brands of hardware RAID controllers. I learned Vinum RAID on ancient versions of FreeBSD. I learned Geom RAID when it replaced Vinum. I learned Linux MD RAID. Then I learned ZFS. Then, finally, Butter. So, when I tell you ZFS is the easiest thing, no, it's not because it got to me first. It's because it's the simplest way to manage those things.
It's because Sun spent 100 engineer years trying to make storage not as complicated as that crazy RAID controller you have or the terrible Veritas volume manager. Adding more space to your computer should be as easy as putting in more RAM, right? You put the sticks in, you start the computer, you have more RAM. You don't have to run RAM control magic stuff and initialize it and do secret incantations and stand on one foot in order to get the RAID controller to accept the new drive. It just works. And it doesn't lose your data like ButterFS.
Alexander also skipped the queue. He writes, what file system do you run on a laptop with a single NVMe SSD? Is ZFS overkill?
ZFS, and of course not. There is no general purpose computing use case too small for ZFS. Are there use cases too small for ZFS? Sure. I mean, if you get down into like industrial embedded stuff, you can absolutely get down to a tiny enough scale that you can't afford the feature set of ZFS. But like if you're doing desktop computing, I promise you've got everything you need and everything to justify the use of ZFS.
But do you, Jim, use it on your laptop?
Yes.
Same for me.
With ZFS boot menu?
More recently, yes. I've been setting up my laptops with ZFS boot menu, but even before ZFS boot menu, I was setting up my laptops with a very small ext4 partition for boot and root and doing all the things that mattered, my home dir, any images for VMs I might do, just whatever. But again, I want to reiterate, my home directory always is on a ZFS pool on the same single disk in that one laptop because it's worth it.
Yeah, it's kind of like asking, well, my car has airbags, so is my seatbelt overkill? It's like, no, don't risk your life. Wear the bloody seatbelt.
And don't risk your data. Use ZFS.
Exactly. Even if you only have one disk, ZFS is at least going to be able to tell you if, hey, this data we just read back off the disk isn't what it's supposed to be. Maybe you want to check it, or at least, you're not feeding gibberish into an application and making it crash or not work.
And Joe, since you brought up ZFS boot menu specifically, let me go ahead and bring forward a very widely applicable use case to say why you want ZFS on your laptop. Because if you set it properly with ZFS boot menu from the ground up, one of the features of ZFS boot menu is that it really, really separates the boot magic from the operating system to a degree that you can literally boot a ZFS boot menu system off of the thumb drive if you want to. Whether or not you do it normally, typically you will set up a teeny tiny, EFI partition that's just formatted FAT32 and you drop the loader on it and you'll boot all from that one drive. But you can also just set up a thumb drive and put the loader on it. And if you boot off of that thumb drive, it will find any pool with a ZFS boot menu installed operating system on it that the computer can see and it will allow you to boot from it. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, in relation to a laptop is this means if you installed your laptop with ZFS boot menu, you can use ZFS replication to replicate your entire laptop image off to another system. And then if your laptop dies and you have to replace it or whatever, you can literally just drop the ZFS boot menu loader, which again is one single file that goes into one small FAT32 partition, drop that there, create the pool, replicate your whole freaking laptop back from your backup and boot it. You're done. That's the whole restoration. Everything is back. Everything is configured. Everything is just the way that it was before.
And expanding on that, you could do the same between your desktop computer and your laptop computer, for example. You could regularly replicate your desktop that you use every day onto your laptop so that it's good to go when you have to go out to a client or have to go away for the weekend.
Absolutely.
Hello, Linux people. Welcome to the future. We've been doing this for 10 years. I do exactly what Jim was talking about. When I have to go to a conference, I take my development system, ZFS send it to my laptop, go to the conference, do the conference, come back, ship it back to my development system. And also, I give a talk at FOSDEM about the fact that because I don't use my laptop, except for when I'm going to conferences, it's generally out of date the couple of weeks before the conference, which is the worst possible time to update your operating system and all your packages. Even there's a risk something might not work because you're not using it every day. You're not going to find these problems before you're trying to give a presentation in front of a bunch of people. So having the ZFS boot environment feature that ZFS boot menu gives you means that, hey, I've done my machine, it worked great, except for now the HDMI output doesn't work because I didn't try that or whatever. I just reboot, select the older image out of the boot menu, and boom, I'm back to my system how it was 2 weeks before, except my home directory is still the one from today. So it has the new version of my slides, not the 2-week-old one. So being able to separate the operating system from your home directory and being able to just randomly fast forward and rewind through time to find the one that works and get your system back up means you're up and going in a couple seconds. Or even I helped somebody at a conference in the Hacker Lounge one time. It's like, so I have my laptop. It's all set up exactly how I like it. It's on ZFS. I bought this new laptop. Can I just transfer the data? It's like, yeah, we hooked up an Ethernet cable between them, ZFS send, pipe, ZFS receive, splat it down the bootloader, boot up the new machine. The new, faster laptop is like, oh, hey, I have the whole system. I can't even tell that it's not my old laptop.
If we're going to be snarky about welcome to the future, Linux folks, FreeBSD's been here for a decade. Sure, that's true. But the new thing is you can now have all this on a laptop that you actually want.
And where you don't have to use an Ethernet cable.
Yeah.
I still want an Ethernet cable. I don't know about you.
Let me know when you manage to get Elden Ring booted up and running at 60 frames per second on your FreeBSD laptop, Alan.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.